Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today for the Colorado West Land Trust. We've been doing some informational lunches during the past year. It's been a nice way to connect with all of you during the pandemic and when people have been working from home and just not being able to get out. And it's actually been really great to connect with you all and share information about conservation and about conservation related issues that tie into our work and private lands conservation. I know some of you have attended some of Mark Hermansted's presentations on water rights and some of the Talbot's presentation on agricultural use out in the East Valley of the Grand Valley. So thank you guys for joining us today for the importance of conserving wildlife habitat in Western Colorado. I think all of you are familiar with the Land Trust because you got an email to join this, an email invite to join this presentation. And as you know, we work from Mesa County down to San Miguel County and kind of Gunnison County over to the state line. So we cover a vast service area that has a huge variety of wildlife habitat. And Brad's gonna touch on some different aspects of that. And we conserve private lands throughout this area of Western Colorado, everything from small irrigated peach farms in Palisade to large sprawling ranches on Glade Park and the west end of Montrose County. So a huge array of the types of properties that we conserve. And today we're going to take a look just at wildlife in Western Colorado and the importance of that. So today we have Brad Banulis joining us. Brad, thanks for being here. I'll let him talk about where he is and how that virtual background that looks so appealing to all of us right now, maybe not just virtual. But Brad currently serves on the Colorado West Land Trust Board, and he is the Northwestern Region Senior Biologist up here in Grand Junction. He's grew up in Wyoming, Arizona, and Colorado, and got his Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Biology from Colorado State University, and then went to the University of Wyoming for graduate school. He, as a private lands biologist, Brad has worked with landowners to enhance wildlife habitat through farm bill programs and provide them with technical assistance. He's worked for, from 2004 to 2020, he was wildlife biologist with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So I know he knows some of you on the call that are associated or worked with CPW. And his kind of service area that he's covered, Delta, Gunnison, Hinsdale, Mesa, Montrose, Ouray, and San Miguel counties. So pretty much very similar to the counties that Colorado West Land Trust represents as well. And he and his wife, Tanya, who's also a wildlife biologist, and their two young kids like spending time outdoors and doing youth sporting and fishing, hunting, camping, hiking, and traveling. So we're very lucky to have Brad and the expertise that he brings to our board. And Brad, I always appreciate your input when we're working on projects and what's important and what's great wildlife habitat and where the critical pieces that we're looking at. So I enjoy working with you on the Lands Committee. Pass it off to you, just a couple quick housekeeping items. I do want to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar, so we will make it available online, probably through YouTube, I think is what Dylan and I have been discussing, so that if you want to watch it again or you want to share it with friends or people that couldn't make the webinar today, we'll be able to do that. And Brad and I chatted. He is happy to take questions throughout the presentation, so don't feel like you need to hold them for the end. Feel free to, I think, at the very bottom of your screen, there should be a little raise hand button, or just type something in the chat and Dylan and I will try to keep an eye on your questions that come up there. And, or if you can't do either of those, just shout it, just turn your mic on and shout it out. And we're happy to take your questions throughout the presentation. We'll try to wrap up by 1 o'clock so everyone can get back to the rest of their day. So without further ado, Brad, thank you for joining us, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Alana. I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, this was great a great honor even to be asked to talk about habitat and the importance of habitat in Western Colorado for the Land Trust, and so I appreciate this opportunity. As I was thinking about it, what I found is that there's a lot of different things to cover. So what I'm kind of looking at is just kind of giving some general overview of habitat and important habitats from a Colorado Parks and Wildlife standpoint, at least, and wildlife biologists in general. And then kind of some of our guiding documents, importance of habitats for species of greatest conservation need, as well as game species. And then also just going to kind of wrap or show some examples. Largely, I figured with the everybody's, I think, a lot more familiar with work and habitats in Mesa County area. So what I was going to kind of do, even though now I'm the Northwest Region senior biologist, I was going to kind of focus a lot more on the southern parts of the service area and talk about a lot of work that maybe ties into some stuff that I've done in the past, but also some of our different projects that are examples of how we get to and how we learn and designate important wildlife habitats in Western Colorado. And we'll kind of go from there. So yeah, as Ilana alluded to, so the currently it is a virtual background, but that's a background that's about 100 yards down the walkway from where I'm currently sitting in Southwest Florida. I'm down on Sanibel Island for a little family vacation, but and kind of if anybody's familiar with it or not, but Sanibel is an interesting place as well, because even though Florida in general is highly developed landscape, Sanibel Island is a cool place in that half of it's a wildlife refuge, and a long time ago they actually put in a lot of restrictions on development and even as far as how tall buildings can be, resorts. So it's not a overly developed place, but it's a really cool landscape with obviously very different habitat than what we see in Colorado, which is kind of cool to come out and see the numerous birds as well as all the fish and wildlife species of a place like this. So yeah. So as Ilana said, like we do spend a lot of time with the family, just out doing different things in the outdoors and traveling, and we're taking our time right now. But it was great to be able to sit down and give a presentation to you to talk about wildlife back in obviously a very important realm for myself as a former area biologist out of Montrose, serving the southern part of the study area of the work area for the Land Trust, as well as now being the Northwest senior biologist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So I want to keep this pretty informal, and I can ramble a lot, but I'd like to answer questions too if people have them. So like Ilana said, if you have anything, just feel free to answer or to ask the question. So just I was going to go ahead and pull this up real quick, just showing the Land Trust service area, and really some of the stuff that I'm going to kind of more talk about is more around the Uncompahgre Plateau, the southern part of Mesa County, Delta counties, Montrose, Ouray, San Miguel counties, West End stuff. But a lot of it's at a larger context too, and that's kind of where I'm going to start, is more in this larger part of Colorado. So with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and every state has in the U.S. has a state wildlife action plan, and what they call the SWAMP. The SWAMP identifies species and habitats that are most vulnerable, as well as the needed conservation actions for those species. So this plan has some main guiding principles of encouraging and supporting conservation actions, managing for healthy habitats and ecosystems to benefit all species. So that's largely what we want to emphasize today. A flexible plan for adaptable management as new research is available and innovative conservation actions are developed. So we always need to adapt. We're constantly learning, and we want to adapt to the information that we have. Acknowledge the pivotal role that private landowners and local stakeholders play in conservation. So again, whether it's related to habitat management, to land management actions, or to just being an interested stakeholder in for wildlife and wildlife habitat, everybody needs to be involved and holds a role. enhance this plan really was just meant to enhance other planning opportunities, not to necessarily overstep or lead to anything, but it's just kind of a guiding document on largely, like I said, related to species of greatest conservation concern. And then at the same time, maintain and enhance cooperation and collaboration efforts among wildlife managers, those private and public land managers, as well as other stakeholders to develop and implement conservation actions. So within it's an awesome plan, and with a lot of information on these different species of greatest conservation need. So within, and this is just focused on Colorado, these are the tier 1 species. They're all listed right here between amphibians, birds, mammals, reptiles, and fish. I'm not going to read them all off, but I guess a few things that I wanted to highlight even from this list are are even related to greater sage grouse habitat. We hear a lot about a lot of work that's done on greater sage grouse in northwest Colorado. Sandhill cranes, largely the San Luis Valley is been known for a long time for sandhill cranes. The eastern plains get a lot of sandhills that migrate and spend time across the eastern plains. In western Colorado, it's been interesting over the last 20 years, just the increase in birds that we've had in northwest Colorado that are actually summering and nesting up there in the Hayden country, even down towards Meeker, as well as interestingly down out around Delta, the birds that are overwintering in Delta, where in Delta County and Harts Basin area, it's long been a destination even for people to observe cranes that were on migration as they were heading from wintering ranges down in New Mexico and heading north. Now some of these birds are actually stopping and spending more time in the Delta area. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later too. But between those species, and these species run a whole variety of habitat types, up to American pica on the Alpine, and then down to these lower elevation species, like I said, whether it's on the eastern plains or pocket mice or Preble's meadow jumping mouse along the Front Range. So there's a whole variety of species that this plan's really kind of focused on providing some direction to and emphasis. Now, at the same time, one of the things, and I don't remember if this other slide that I have in here on habitats will really show it, but one of the reasons that they are of kind of greatest conservation need for a lot of these species is that we just don't have a lot of information. Some species we do, and we're able to manage for and work on more closely, but a lot of the majority of these species that are in the swamp, actually, we don't have a lot of information on. So that's one of the main conservation actions, is just research to get better information. And then there is a tier 2 species. I'm going to back up here real quick. So one thing you'll notice on here is that you don't see mule deer, elk, bighorn sheep aren't. Those species, largely, a lot of those species are not in the swamp, other than bighorn sheep. Bighorn sheep are identified as a tier 2 species within the State Wildlife Action Plan, and do provide direction for management conservation, largely because they've lost so much of their historic range. We estimate we're around 8,000 bighorns around across Colorado between Rocky Mountain bighorn and desert bighorn sheep, and but the amount of habitat, even in Colorado and across the West, is occupied habitat has greatly decreased from what it historically was. This is a really busy map, and hopefully it's coming across okay as I send it from Southwest Florida here. But this map is really just a map showing all those key habitats of Colorado. From the Alpine Habitats in the highest elevations down to sand sage on the eastern plains, as well as, in particularly, and I don't know if anybody can really see my cursor too well, but in west central, southwest Colorado, we have a lot of the, thanks, it's helpful to know. We obviously have a lot of pinyon juniper habitat, which is really, provides a lot of habitat, both from seasonal for winter range mule deer and elk populations, to pinyon jay habitat as well, which is a tier 1 species of concern from the swamp that we're currently actually right now trying to get more information on nesting and breeding activity in Western Colorado, largely because as between whether it's drought impacts, climate change, the outbreaks of Ips beetles, we're seeing declining pinions trees well across the West. And so there's a concern for what is that doing to pinyon jay populations. But across the Uncompahgre Plateau and then up on Pinyon Mesa here, we also have abundant aspen communities, mixed conifer communities. Western or south, the Central Rockies, lodgepole pine has been a big concern. I mean, it's abundant historically, but with beetle outbreaks, beetle outbreaks has really hindered a lot of lodgepole communities. So, and we've seen a lot of different, disease issues across Western Colorado as well in our vegetation types. Drought is impacting sagebrush communities right now in a lot of places where in historically early 2000s we saw sagebrush defoliation, even in Gunnison Basin at higher elevation, as well as far out in western Colorado and Dry Creek Basin, we were seeing defoliation. We saw defoliation up in northwest Colorado as well, where that sagebrush really just looked like it died with the extreme drought conditions. It actually, not all of it did die. Some of it came back, but only part of the plant would actually come back with leaves on it. So these are all, really important habitats and different types of habitats for different species, as well as different seasonal use. So, if we're talking about alpine habitats up here in the San Juans, up in the flat tops, we're talking about habitat that provide, winter or summer range for mule deer and for elk. Yet in the winter, they're going to be more reliant on those lower elevation sagebrush, mountain shrub, pinyon juniper type habitat types. So all of this is so interconnected and just really shows the value of all habitat types. Across the Grand Valley here, a lot of this doesn't show up as important habitat type within, for at least within the swamp. Some of this being, obviously just houses, but also a lot of farm ground. Now, at the same time, those farm ground is important for some species in particular. On the eastern plains, looking at some of the different migratory birds, piping plovers and terns, as well as even here and in that delta country, like I was saying, with wintering sandhill crane populations as well. So this just kind of wraps in those different habitat types and communities that are identified as important within the state wildlife action plan of the different forest types, grasslands, different shrublands, desert shrub being common in west central Colorado, greasewood, as well as oak and mixed shrublands, sagebrush, saltbush, sand sage, upland shrub, and these are some of those habitat types that historically have been converted in a lot of places for agricultural lands or for houses or just to try to attempt to grow better forage even for wildlife, where we've taken out historically taken out sagebrush or different shrubs in order to improve grass composition and forb composition for species. Now we've learned a lot of things over the years, and now we're kind of tackling things in some different manners, which is all good. I mean, we're adapting, we're learning, and we're trying to improve the habitat the best we can. So then this kind of shows the threats and conservation actions for habitats. So I pulled this just straight out of the State Wildlife Action Plan. But of the threats for habitat types across all of them, the number one threat identified for everything is residential commercial development. So this obviously is where a land trust plays such a key role in habitat conservation, habitat management for whether it is protecting wildlife habitat, protecting open space, protecting vegetation communities, as well as agricultural land. So all of this number one threat and issue is therefore the number one conservation action needed in the table at the bottom is improving habitat and natural process restoration, the site area management, as well as resource and habitat protection. So I just kind of wanted to show, the importance in the state wildlife action plan, which this is also, as a side note too, that having a state wildlife action plan is actually how the states go about prioritizing projects, species management, species that we're gonna, that we're trying to get more information on, in order to go to Fish and Wildlife Service to get additional funding, additional resources to help study these species and conserve and manage these species, and therefore these habitat types across Colorado as well. So that, these are a few of the most recent things and big documents that, are prioritizing different habitat types. One of the big things that we worked on, and especially the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission worked on this last year, was the adoption of Senate Bill 181. And within 181, there's a lot of protections added in, additional protections added in for high priority habitats. And this was actually even in the previous oil and gas regulations and 1298 rules from the 2000s. But the 181 rules are actually even probably a little stronger. But what this shows here is, and this is a map that I just pulled from the COGCC, the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission, Conservation Commission. They have a great website tool for looking at development, as well as identifying where they have our high priority habitat maps. And what this yellow layer is across Colorado, kind of those high priority habitats that had been identified. And obviously it's not everything out there, but it does cover a lot of country. And it doesn't mean that can't be also where any development takes place. It just means that this is where we've identified our high priority habitats, and that there either needs to be some recognition of maybe potentially no development, but really more of, developing a conservation plan and just addressing these. And a lot of this is even just maybe seasonally based. One of the largest things that's covering this is mule deer and elk winter range concerns, pronghorn winter range concerns. So even though a lot of this is identified in yellow, it's not that there's not going to be development taking place. It's just that the timing and stuff needs to be considered when new wells are going in, at least in relation to development of in deer and elk habitat. It also, this yellow layer just generally covers lecking areas for sage grouse and sharptails, Columbian sharp-tailed grouse, greater sage grouse, Gunnison sage grouse. There's not a lot of development potential in a lot of the Gunnison sage grouse country, but it is identified as a high priority habitat for the COGCC, as well as Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And part of it is just, those with, especially something like with sage grouse, when they're in their lek, when they're on the lek in the spring, they're in their mating season. Any kind of disturbance could really affect where those birds, if they're out there trying to lek, they're trying to display, and they get disturbed off of those leks, then it's really hindering potentially the ability for them to continue to mate, or it's also kind of pushing them off and pushing them into other places that maybe they're just more susceptible to predation. So these are all just different considerations, but all related to the high priority habitats of different species in Colorado. And there are some different levels here. It's kind of hard to see, but breaking this on the left in the legend, like I said, the yellow is the high priority habitats, but then there's some different rules. The 1202C, which these are the no surface occupancy habitats. These are really, really defined ones, really small, related to specific lekking areas for different grouse species. It is bighorn sheep production areas where they are lambing. Those areas are identified, as well as a variety of other species, but it's a pretty limited list. Most of it is related to these 1202D density habitats, which are more of if a development is going to exceed a certain well density of greater than 1 well per square mile, essentially, then there needs to be consultation, and there may also be need to be some mitigation completed to improve and conserve habitats to off balance those impacts related to development of those habitat types. during those kind of seasonal considerations. So this is another one, big one that's, it's just emphasizing how important wildlife habitat is, but from a different perspective and more from looking at different seasonal type uses, not just your straight, habitat vegetation type, but when is it being used for different species throughout their lifetime. And so really, all of this is important just from that standpoint of habitat fragmentation. So, habitat, and I probably should have started out with this, but I mean, habitat is just where we live, where a species lives that provides for water, shelter, and food. And when you have habitat fragmentation, then you're breaking up the continuity of those resources for an individual species or for their needs during that specific time of year. So habitat fragmentation gets to be a big concern. And in Colorado, it really, as conservation minded as Colorado is, it's a tough dilemma as well, because people like to be outdoors. People like to move to Colorado, as this graph shows. This is old. I mean, this is just from '09, but it was just showing, the steady increase in population. And actually, we should be able to, I should be able to get the better information now with the most recent census, if I think numbers are starting to come out. I mean, Colorado's population is just growing and growing. And even during a pandemic over the last year, it's been amazing the number of people moving to Colorado, and then also spending a lot of time in the outdoors. So it's just another example of why we really need to be conscientious of habitat fragmentation and the effects on those wildlife habitats throughout the year. It's modifying habitat, it's adjusting for the habitat use or reducing available habitat totally for species. It's causing animals just for that increased vigilance, or that, it's just that they're more aware, they're a little more stressed. Some species, bighorn sheep, they may be watching people on a trail, yet at the same time, their heart rates are elevated. And while we don't necessarily know if there is a true physiological impact to those species, it is stuff that we're starting to look into. We actually have a desert bighorn research project right now that we're doing down in the Dominguez Escalante area, looking at effects of recreation on desert bighorn sheep. But that's, we're looking at how that may affect them physically from a lamb survival standpoint, to just habitat use and maybe dispersal, or just changes in how they use the landscape throughout the day. And just like this, changes to foraging strategies. And if you move an animal from optimal habitat where there's good resources for forage, there's water available, and there's great security cover, and you displace them out of that into places maybe that have less quality forage, then that just increases physiological issues, as far as especially from a female standpoint that's maybe trying to raise young, as well as maintain their own body condition going into the next winter, and building resources. Or it also potentially can make them more susceptible to predation. So, and with that, we may see these reduced recruitment issues of just fewer young individuals being recruited into a population, or and lower survival rates overall, maybe from adults or from the young as well. But at least from some research that's been done recently too, I mean, looking at larger scale projects, residential housing and energy extraction are the primary mechanisms of habitat fragmentation in Colorado. But something that I think is hasn't necessarily been quantified as well, but is starting to get there, is also just human use on the ground, even just fragmenting habitat through whether it's trail use or recreational activity. So I'm kind of getting moving into some of the different aspects related to habitat that just really emphasize the importance of habitat. And as we look at different specific issues related to individual species. And I'm over some of these next examples I'm going to provide are largely more big game related, because that's largely what I was focused on working on when I was working down out of the Montrose area. But some of these issues actually, deer and elk are kind of a good indicator species too of what may be going on the landscape, whether it's habitat fragmentation, to forage effects, drought effects, which obviously is going to trickle down to a lot of other species where we just don't have as much information. So one of the things that we've been really interested in Colorado is decreased fawn-doe ratios. And some of that has been tied, at least in through some research that Heather Johnson had done, looking at decreased fawn-doe ratios being significantly correlated with increased residential development and energy development. And this graph here kind of shows it's broke out by what they call DAU, or a deer data analysis unit, and which is largely a deer population. Not entirely a closed population, but it's the best representation of a closed population. As this map shows here, we have Grand Junction. Pinyon Mesa is here where it says D18. The north side of the Grand Mesa is here where it says D12. So where we've seen, increasing residential development and decreasing fawn-doe ratios. Another project that we've been really interested in, and I should say the deer issue is one that's not unique to Colorado either. It is something that's been seen across the West: declining deer populations, declining recruitment, large-scale drought impacts to just natural increases in predators as well, to habitat development and habitat loss. So there's a lot of things going on there's no silver bullet to any species management issue, but habitat carries a number of different concerns associated with it that we need to be paying attention to. So from the elk standpoint, in 2017, actually, we started up a pilot project looking at some concerns for declining calf-cow ratios in different elk populations across southern Colorado. Northern Colorado, fortunately, for the most part, is still looking pretty good. But even there, we've seen, just really slow declines in calf-cow ratios, and with a lot of concerns related to habitat, whether it's historic carrying capacity, competition between, with elk between deer, maybe in some places, maybe associated with livestock, but more of a concern just based on drought conditions and forage availability. But then there are still other concerns, whether it is related to wolves or here. So essentially, what we started out with was two study areas on the Uncompahgre Plateau and then down in the Trinidad area, and this Trinidad Trinchera elk herd. That's actually a place though that's largely private land and large ranches, some little pieces of public land, a lot of energy development, but it's in these southern latitudes too that drought conditions are playing an impact, as well as some predator concerns as well. I think the Uncompahgre Plateau, we were seeing decreasing calf-cow ratios, definitely seeing impacts related to drought conditions, both on winter range habitat types and, like I was mentioning earlier, defoliating sagebrush communities, to even in the in higher elevation summer habitat types, and the sudden aspen decline in aspens and lack of aspen recruitment even in there. And while there's been some wondering if ungulates, wild ungulates like deer and elk and livestock, cattle were inhibiting aspen regrowth, some studies done on the Uncompahgre Plateau showed no, that's not necessarily the case. There's a whole variety of issues associated with that, and where we're just having to pay attention to drought conditions, development, and a whole variety of stressors across the landscape. This Avalanche Creek elk herd is out of the Aspen Carbondale country. This one was added in because we have been seeing some decreasing elk populations and lower calf-cow ratios, and really wondering about the impacts of recreation potentially in this landscape when you have animals that are that are spending their summer in higher elevation habitats, but that is also experiencing heavy recreation activity. And in the Bears Ears elk herd up here in E2, near the Craig country, it runs essentially from Maybell out over to Steamboat. That country is, I mean, that elk population has some of our highest calf-cow ratios overall, but at the same time, we're actually seeing we've actually seen in some places where we're not seeing the numbers of elk like we used to, as well as concerns over calf-cow ratios, especially around the Steamboat area that has experienced, heavy development in housing development, loss of habitat, or at least increased fragmentation, as well as lots of recreational activity in those areas too. Another example of a project that I was working on and in charge of on the Uncompahgre Plateau that really was focused on collecting different information on monitoring mule deer populations, but it really has allowed us to look at seasonal habitat use is our long-term mule deer monitoring studies. And there's a map here in the lower left that kind of shows in Colorado where we have these studies. We have one on the Uncompahgre Plateau. We have two in Northwest Colorado between the Piceance Basin around Meeker area, and then over in the Middle Park area, Hot Sulphur. And then down in Southwest Colorado with the Uncompahgre, we also have Gunnison Basin, and over in the Buena Vista country as well, we have a mule deer monitoring study there right now as well, with actually a big research project going on too. But these studies were designed to intensively look at monitoring represented mule deer populations based on habitat types, so that we could use those to kind of as surrogates to manage for adjacent deer populations as well, where we were really focused on measuring survival information, and we were collaring individuals and monitoring survival, looking at what they died from as well. But like I said, we were able to additionally look at seasonal habitat use and distribution. And at the same time, I was able to even use one of these collars here on my son Tyler when he was young to help keep track of him, or at least he got to come out and help me with recovering collars on the project. And this map just is showing, this is actually a little bit older map, but it shows what we were able to see from some of these location data and some of this movement, and really to see how important adjacent habitat types are and how they get used throughout the year. These arrows are showing essentially, the Uncompahgre Plateau is a great example, because what we have is around the Uncompahgre Plateau here are all low elevation winter ranges, largely sagebrush, pinyon juniper, ag dominated field, agricultural fields, corn, hay, in the Uncompahgre Valley down towards Ridgeway, that those animals use as well. But then they migrate up to towards the top of the Uncompahgre Plateau, where they're using more of a mountain shrub, aspen, mixed conifer type habitat. And typically we've all in Colorado, we've really said that winter ranges are a limiting factor, and for a variety of reasons it is. Part of that is because in winter ranges is largely where development does take place. Historically, it is where agricultural fields maybe were put in, larger water bodies are available, the rivers and stuff all coming down, providing more water availability for communities and agriculture. And on the higher elevations, you just didn't have that as much. It was more designated as national forest. But in different places in Colorado, you do see a whole variety, and it just shows the importance of all of those habitats, and both from a public and private land standpoint. These arrows are kind of showing those seasonal movements, and how animals move. But we started to see, we were able to document different information too of how animals move from northwest of Ridgeway and moving down south, even having animals that were wintering out of the Nucla area on the west end and summering down near Dolores. I even had a deer I had and I documented this in, I think, 2019, a fawn that was captured with a collar just south of, or just north of Ridgway, sorry, between Ridgway and Kelowna. And that individual spent the summer somewhere in far western Colorado. And I don't even know exactly where it spent the summer, but I know that come winter or October, I found it kind of over in this area, just west of Dove, or sorry, just east of Dove Creek. And it just shows how much movement some of these animals use to come back every year to one particular agricultural field, to come back to one clump of sagebrush, and just how important some of these specific habitat types and really specific sites on the landscape are. Another document, I mean, that we've been able to use some of this information from mule deer monitoring studies is contributed to our big game winter range and migration corridors management. There's a secretarial order that really put an emphasis on management of migration corridors and winter ranges. And then we also have a governor's executive order as well that directed Colorado Parks and Wildlife to study and to help protect and manage these migration corridors. So this is all something else that we've been really spending a lot more time on really over the last 5 years. Just a couple other examples of some projects. Desert bighorn augmentation efforts and habitat utilization studies. Augmentation efforts largely have been done on public lands, but we've through the same kind of collaring projects, all of these individuals were released in the Dolores River, but we've been able to see how they use even some private lands over there that are adjacent to public lands, and really, especially associated with water opportunities. This is a picture of some bighorn sheep down in Escalante Canyon. They use those agricultural fields heavily with that population in Escalante. So having those high quality forage resources, those animals do adapt to some of the activity in relation just for those that higher quality forage. We had a project out of Uray looking at habitat utilization of bighorn sheep in relation to domestic sheep as well. There are concerns for interaction there and potential disease transmission, but also just kind of how animals use the landscape. This is a group of ewes that you can't see it. It's zoomed in pretty well here, but right at their feet is some hay that was put out. It is on private property, but the landowner had not done this, but other people had done it. It's right next to a road as well. But people were throwing out hay for the sheep just to try to provide them some resources in a year when there was some really good snow. Side note, that's not the best to provide them really green alfalfa hay in the winter. If they're not used to it, their digestive systems don't do really well with it, and they can actually starve because of it. But I definitely understand the desire to provide some food for these individuals that are having to fend through the winter. But I was going to show this. Hopefully, I know this is a map that's kind of hard to see. It's a 3D image. To the right is Uray, Colorado. Farther west, you can't see, is Ridgway. This is the Dexter Creek drainage, this Cutler Creek drainage. And all these different dots are just how bighorns use the landscape, or how some collared bighorns had used the landscape over time. But really, what I wanted to kind of highlight too is, a lot of this is the steeper stuff, higher elevation winter range or summer range up in here. Even some winter use if the snow isn't too deep. But then these animals can get really forced into some small areas down out of Uray. If you travel south out of Uray towards Silverton, sometimes you'll see some of those individuals right next to the highway too. And it's some steep, rugged terrain, and that they're utilizing in the winter. And this it's a spot that they call Jackass Flats that has been a private. I think part of it's private, part of it's public, but that's just always been a bigger wintering area for bighorn sheep. And we're just looking at a landscape where you have a huge amount of summer range, but a species that when the snow really gets heavy and they have to migrate down to lower elevation winter ranges, that available habitat actually gets really limited, at least in deep snows. Oh, one thing I was going to mention actually too, sorry, slid around there, but is that even over in the saw pit country, there's out of saw pit, we have some bighorn sheep that'll spend most of the winter up above tree line, but come late February, March, they migrate down to the saw pit area on your way to Telluride there, and you'll see them using some of those private lands and former mining reclamation lands that those bighorn sheep are using in the winter to get some green vegetation as well as some good minerals coming off of the winter. And then just like I'd mentioned earlier too, with sandhill cranes in Delta County, this is just example, thanks to Van Graham for a couple pictures. And all the years that I'd been monitoring some of these birds over there, I never had any great pictures, and Van's able to help me out. But like I said, you know, it's been interesting over the last 10 to 15 years. You know, we never used to see many birds wintering in the Delta area, just migrating through out of that Eckert Cedar Ridge country. And then now we're starting to see upwards of really pretty consistently over the last few years about at least 3,500 birds that are spending their winter in the Delta area. They really are primarily concentrated around Escalante State Wildlife Area and that G50 road. But we're seeing them, you know, especially at times all throughout the Uncompahgre Valley. I think just they may spend most of their time roost up out of Delta, and then they'll actually throughout the day even maybe fly down toward south of Montrose to forage as well, and then roost back up in Delta. I've seen some roosting down in the Montrose area too, and it's been interesting because even over the years up in the Unaweep Canyon, there's actually for a long time there have been a few birds that that'll nest up in the Unaweep. Why they're nesting there, you know, some of this was even before the birds started wintering in Delta. So, you know, why some of these cranes pick different places to nest, I'm not exactly sure, but we are starting to see even more birds in the Delta County area, Montrose County area, where we're starting to see a few more stay in the summer nesting. But then, like I said, up in the Hayden country, Northwest Colorado, we're seeing lots of birds through the Yampa River Valley that are spending the summer and nesting up in the valley there. So just a couple slides just to wrap up, you know, so I mean, obviously habitat is important for a whole variety of species in different times of year. And then, so what do we do about this? And habitat conservation and management are, you know, the best as a resource manager and a wildlife manager that we can try to work towards. And especially working with the land trust, and even with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we do have our wildlife protection program where we work with land trusts on conservation easements as well. But, you know, protecting habitat and protecting it through conservation easements or habitat acquisitions by state agencies does occur at times through, you know, developing more state wildlife areas or maybe even more state park opportunities. But, you know, I think the best tool that we can look at is conservation easements. I did put in here natural area designations. We do have a natural area program that does work to identify kind of key vegetation characteristics, maybe some unique species or endangered species, as well as identifying even unique archaeological resources or wildlife species. But you know, even just having some of these designations, not that it fully protects any kind of development or fragmentation, modification to take place, but at least that kind of highlights the issues and the importance of different habitat types. And then there's the whole management side. I mean, and this is, you know, between these last two, like these are whole other talks and you know, even, I mean, these are whole other classes in college setting too, but there's a whole variety of tools to look at habitat management. whether it's just, weed control and management of exotic species to habitat restoration, sagebrush restoration, or aspen regeneration. These are all just examples, but even looking at wet meadow restoration. There's if you can see it here, kind of in the central right-hand side, underneath the burning sagebrush and greasewood. There's an example of what they call a Z-dike structure. This one's kind of in depth with actually putting in this metal structure. A lot of times they're just using rock, but the idea is really just to, this was actually a much bigger gully right here, and adding in some of these rocks and these metal weirs in here to just slow down vegetation, catch sediment behind it and in front of it, and just slow down the movement of water to try to build back up some of these gullies and improve riparian habitat, really in particular these wet meadows where you can get a lot of forb production, broadleaf plant production, as well as insects that birds like Gunnison sage grouse, greater sage grouse need for their chicks and for adults in the summer for that high nutrient value. Also looking at fire mitigation projects. There's a lot of stuff going on in Colorado. I mean, obviously you look at the wildfires that we had last year, some of that, on especially the bigger forests is not going to be, real easy to control, but, working with landowners to, on fire mitigation, but also to, incorporate wildlife habitat into wildlife habitat concerns into that fire mitigation. Not getting rid of all trees isn't a good thing for all wildlife species either. So, the best you could try to do to protect WUI areas, the wildlife urban interface, houses that are on the edges of wildlands, as well as maintaining wildlife habitat. But then, with fire can be a great tool actually as well. I mean, and can help regenerate a landscape. But then there's also some, restoration that we have to do. I mean, Colorado Parks and Wildlife spent over $400,000, acquired and spent over $400,000 on native seed this last year, applying native seed to just not all of it, but to specific areas, important wildlife areas on the Pine Gulch fire in out of Mesa, Garfield counties, as well as up on the Mullen fire up in North Park, and the East Troublesome fire out of Grand County. And then there's even programs like the Conservation Reserve Program through Farm Service Agency, where you have a program that in private lands where you're providing wildlife habitat and protection of even just forage resources and production of bugs just through not doing anything. And sometimes that's what's needed in certain areas, whether it's to benefit wildlife habitat or really from the goal of CRP initially was more at erosion and protected highly erodible land. So there's a whole variety. These aren't all the management tools either, but just kind of an example, and maybe this can even be another webinar in the future. But and with that, I guess I'll just leave it at that and open it up if there are any questions. I kind of rambled a lot today, so hopefully it was beneficial, but I'm opening it up for any questions.
So we do have a question from Lorian. If half of the state is in the yellow priority, then how do you prioritize activities? Which I think is a good question. I mean, we're working on a conservation plan right now. We don't know what the results are, but how do you, I think we run into that same thing. If you have all of these things that are a priority, how do you really decide what you work on?
No, that's a great question. Well, and I guess that's the thing, with that high priority habitat for 181, it wasn't, I mean, that's kind of a culmination of all of those different species, and they don't all necessarily occur on one acre of land. So, I mean, there is that aspect that maybe there's, they're not all right there, but especially when we're looking at, protecting deer winter ranges or elk winter ranges, they overlap and they are larger landscapes. So no, I mean, it kind of depends on what your management objectives and goals are for that in particular land, specific, site specific area, as well as, for what the goals are for that for that property, or public land, even from that standpoint. But it is. I mean, I'll be honest. Like, as a wildlife biologist too, it's like it gets kind of ominous at times when there's so many things that you want to protect and you want to do the right thing for from a management standpoint, but you're kind of limited on resources and as well. So it's not the easiest by any means.
Anyone else have any questions for Brad? Brad, you had a nice compliment. Steve Smith said, thanks for a great overview presentation. Interesting to get a feel for what is being done. And you got a little clap from Rick Kruger there.
Thanks, Rick.
Can you share your thoughts on how to balance recreation and habitat conservation? I think that's especially pertinent right now, as we're seeing, especially this past year, just huge increase in outdoor recreation and people interested in that. So how do you balance that with, habitat?
Oh, it's a great question, and it's a tough one too. It's one of those things that I think the vast majority of people who want to be outdoors is because they enjoy being outdoors. They want to see wildlife. They like the vegetation, even just, seeing the flowers, seeing the rock formations. Everybody that is out there, for the most part, want to enjoy wildlife as well. Yet, they don't want to impact the resource. And a lot of people don't necessarily even think that they're impacting the resource when they may, inadvertently be. So it's a tough issue. I've had some discussions even with the BLM on, trying to look at places where, maybe we don't have as much wildlife use. And that's always kind of tough too, to try to sit down, even look at maps on, okay, where don't we have any wildlife concerns? And because really there's a lot of places that have wildlife. So then, this kind of also goes back to Lauren's question too. If everything's high priority, how do you manage out those priorities? But some of it's even just, seasonal use too. So, I think we've been able to balance even where some mountain bike trails and developments are with winter stipulations, where the trails are closed in the wintertime. So they can still allow, for use in the summer and fall, just not in the winter and spring when those animals are most stressed. So it's one of those that, again, there's no silver bullet to it and no firm direction, I'd say. And I think really the key is cooperation and collaboration. That's one of the things that we've really tried to work with, more on the area standpoint is, if some of the trails groups are interested in developing trails, then talking to your local district wildlife manager first and saying, hey, we're looking at something here and let's talk, and just see what, any kind of issues are, and identifying those issues at the beginning. So.
Yeah, and I think those issues are not going away. I think it's just going to increase, and we're going to have to figure out more and more how we balance those.
Oh, exactly. That's the thing. Whether you're a biologist or you're not a biologist, but you enjoy being in the outdoors. You want that. It's a fine line, I guess, there. But but it's a struggle. I think that we have probably in Colorado, maybe more so than other places, just because the number of people who want to be outdoors. But I guess it's, in some ways, though, it's a good problem to have when we have a lot of people who are still passionate about the resource that want to recreate. So. Right.
No, I think that's it. How do you tap into the people that are passionate about it and, get them to be advocates for conservation, as opposed to just the users of the resources, get them to transfer that into more of the advocacy and supporting conservation. So.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Anyone else? Lorian said, thanks. She had to hop off. Anyone else questions for Brad? All right, well, we're a few minutes over, but this was a wonderful presentation and good conversation afterwards. And as I said, we will have this, we've been recording, so we'll have it available online. And I'm sure Dylan will get that information out whenever it's been posted. And Brad, just thank you so much for spending part of your vacation time with us back in Colorado. Definitely. And we appreciate it, and we look forward to possibly doing some more of these. If there's any particular item that people, really gravitated towards or really interested in, perhaps we could do another session at some point, kind of diving deeper into a particular aspect. So Brad, thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity as well.
All right. Well, I will sign us off. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Alana. Thanks, everybody.